Yesterday, we introduced a concept called an ecological footprint. And the big takeaway was how do we reduce that footprint? The number one way to reduce our environmental impact is to stop making more humans. The bottom line, the biggest problem in environmental science, every single is solved if we have a smaller population. We see that we are growing, hopefully you know this word, we are growing exponentially in terms of global population. And we will continue to grow exponentially for a couple more decades, maybe. Hopefully we'll be able to level off after that. I also introduced the idea yesterday that uh, eco footprint varies based on whether a country is developing or developed. And we see that developed nations have already leveled off significantly in terms of population growth. And that's when we become more industrialized, have more technology, healthcare, good schools. We have fewer children, smaller family size. And a lot of that has to do with the idea that we don't need children to work on the farm. As you switch from agricultural to industrial, families tend to be smaller. But in developing nations that are still very much agricultural, they're still having lots of children. And when they have poor health care, some of those children die, so they have more children. It's an endless cycle. This is an interesting graphic. It shows throughout the history of the United States how our population density has changed. We see by the early 1900s, the East Coast is completely settled. And I think of all those cities up and down the Eastern Shoreboard, New York, Philadelphia, Boston. All these cities are very close together. You can hop on the train and ride from one city to the next. It's not until the about 1950, California starts blowing up, 70s, and we see that expansion west that is happening. Okay, so obviously that affects our eco footprint, but what's really happening here is a phenomenon called urbanization. And urbanization is the society or the country moving to urban settings or bigger cities. You can see that, and this is probably a couple years old of data, but at this point, about 80% of the US population lives in a metropolitan area. 80% of citizens are in cities. And you go back 50, 60 years ago, and that was not the case. There was a much more rural population still existing. A megacity would be any city that has at least 10 million people living in it. Urban sprawl is this idea that the city just keeps growing and growing and growing, and there's no end in sight. This is happening all over the United States. We are chewing up forests and farmland because people want to keep building new homes and new neighborhoods. When you have urbanization the way that the United States has had, you have two choices. You can either grow as a city up, think of high rises in places like New York and Chicago, or you can grow out. And guess which one Indianapolis did? We have obviously grown out. How do we combat our eco footprint problems with the idea that, well, we're not going to stop urbanization until we slow the population? There's nothing else we can do. Well, if we build up instead of out, one of the big solutions that's happening all over the world are something called rooftop gardens. And this is not a new idea. Places like Asia, where it's very densely populated, they've been growing food on top of their garden, on top of their buildings for decades now. Now, in places like New York, some of these high-rise apartments have started adding aesthetically pleasing cultural gardens. Places where you can go up to the top of the building and relax to get away from the hustle and bustle of the city. This is a famous architect in Italy who is designing what we call vertical gardens.